This project's been a long time coming. The short version goes like this. At the beginning of June, about 5 months ago, I got an email from LG seeing if I was interested in partnering with them to promote their OLED TV E9. So I took a look at it, and the first thing that caught my eye was the design. It's almost impossibly thin and has this glass bezel that gives it a sort of floating quality. And as cheesy as it sounds, I was inspired. I almost immediately had an idea for a TV stand media console thing that I thought would carry that theme. But we'll talk about the specifics of the design as we go, and get more into the TV a bit later. Alright, let's build it. So for this project, we're going to be using beechwood, and a lot of it. But the good news is it's relatively cheap, at least where I live. I'd say it's a little bit less than half the price of walnut, which if you watch my videos often, you know is what I use the most. The reason that I went with beech was I wanted something on the lighter side, color-wise, so that the detail of the splintered floating legs would show up more. And the reason for that is I had made a test piece of this idea a few months prior out of walnut, and I thought it was just a little bit hard to read. With all of my pieces milled to their proper thicknesses, I could start gluing up some panels. And actually, let's take a second to talk about the construction of this case. So it's going to consist of a top, bottom, 2 sides, 2 vertical partitions, and 2 shelves. The sides are going to get rabbets cut into them to accept the top and bottom pieces. The vertical partitions are going to fit into some stopped dados, and that's because they're going to sit shy of the front of the cabinet. And then the shelves are going to sit on some shelf pins. That way we can move them up and down, or remove them entirely depending on how the piece is going to be used. Along the front of the cabinet, we'll cut 2 grooves which will accept 3 sliding doors. We'll work on those later. And then finally, we'll put a rabbet in the back to accept the back panel pieces. Okay, with all the glue dried, we can get to work. Here Sean's cutting the panels for the top, bottom, and side pieces to their finished lengths, but leaving them wide for now. You'll notice in this shot, I have a bunch of marks on the end of the boards, and that's so that we can keep the grain orientation consistent. Even though something like this is a lot more noticeable when you're using mitered corners instead of rabbets, it still helps to make the piece look a little bit cleaner, at least in my opinion. Next, Sean cut rabbets into the side pieces. And we're actually leaving the pieces a little bit long right now by cutting the rabbet deeper than the top and the bottom pieces are thick. And that way it'll overhang and we can trim it flush later. So really the important thing at this point is just making sure that the area between the 2 rabbets is exactly as long as we want the finished interior height of the cabinet to be. With that done, we could cut the pieces to their final width and then add the rest of the joinery, and this is going to be cut using a router. For the dados, I seem to have the most luck when I use one of my woodpecker squares clamped to the front edge as a guide. But for the grooves in the front and the rabbets in the back, we're going to use an edge guide. While Sean finished that off, I drilled some shelf pin holes into the 2 side pieces as well as into the 2 vertical partitions. And actually, let's back up for a second to talk about the partitions and the shelves. So my plan with those was to paint them a sort of navy blue color. I thought that it might be a nice little touch of color for people when they peek behind the doors. So in this shot, you see me cutting some pieces of plywood to make them out of. Once they were roughed out, I cut some thin strips of beech that I used to cover the front plywood edge and then trimmed it flush over at the table saw. Now, the dados that Sean cut a minute back were made using a 1/2-inch router bit. So to fit a piece of 3/4-inch plywood, I'm going to need to create a sort of tongue to fit in. So that's what I'm marking out and cutting here. Finally, I'm going to trim off the front couple inches of the tongue where the partition is going to extend beyond the dado. With all of that done and my shelf pin holes drilled, I primed the pieces and then the next day put on a few coats of paint. And right about at this point, I realized that I wasn't really feeling the color, so I ended up tossing them and repeated the exact same process, only using more beech hardwood. But since the process is literally the same, I'm not going to show it here, but you'll just notice moving forward that everything is beech instead of painted blue like we talked about. Okay, and finally now with all the parts of the case ready, we can start assembling things. But before I do that, let me take a second to thank LG for sponsoring this video. So this is the 65-inch 4K LG OLED TV E9. And I don't know how, but they managed to pack half the alphabet and a whole lot of tech into this thing. Like I said earlier, the first thing that grabbed me about this TV was just how thin it is, and how the glass bezel gives it a really awesome floating look. But after using it for a while, I realized that there's a whole lot more to it than just good looks. Things like how the Alpha A9 processor uses a deep learning AI algorithm to provide optimal picture quality. See, the main place where we watch TV is our family room. It happens to be pretty open with a few windows, one of which is rather large and just to the right of the screen. Unfortunately, that means sometimes during the day, you can barely see the screen, unless you shut off all the lights and close all the blinds. But with the AI-powered processor, this TV can automatically optimize picture quality according to the content you're watching and the viewing environment. They call it AI Picture, and the processor does the same thing for sound quality too. And it really does make a difference. The TV also comes with Google Assistant and Alexa built in, so you can ask it questions, control smart home appliances, and all sorts of other stuff. And if you're an Apple user like me, with AirPlay 2, you can easily stream from your phone, iPad, and Mac straight to the TV. This guy's pretty good. The bottom line is, this is the best image quality that I've ever experienced at home for TV, movies, games, or anything else you could possibly view on it. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend to understand the technical aspects. Maybe it's the OLED pixels or magic or whatever, but the colors are just super vibrant. The blacks are, well, super black, and the sound is amazing. And it's just an experience that is noticeably above the other 4K TVs that I've owned and used. To learn more, just follow the links in the description below. And thank you again to LG for sponsoring this video. For the base, I'm going to start off with some 8/4 pieces, and my goal here is to cut them down to the same width and thickness and leave them as thick as possible. And that's because I know we're going to lose a lot more material after the epoxy dries. Once that was done, I could get to breaking my pieces to get that splintered effect that I was going for. And I know you've seen Frank Dukes shatter cinder blocks with his palms, but that wasn't going to work here. I'm pretty sure if you tried it, you'd end up at the hospital alongside Ray Jackson and Suan Paredes, courtesy of Chong Li. Trust me, I tried it, said mate, and moved on to other options. So in these shots, I've been testing a few options, and once I felt comfortable, I moved on to the real pieces. And for most, I ended up cutting in a series of kerfs over at the bandsaw, and then used a bunch of clamps to kind of twist and snap things. And then if needed, I could come back with the hammer and use the claw end to further distress. Now, I definitely got better as I went along, and probably should have bought twice as much material for this part as I thought that I needed. That way I could have just picked the best pieces after the fact. But in the end, it came out pretty good, and I'm pleased enough with it. The last thing to do before pouring the epoxy was to build a few forms to pour it into, and this is pretty simple. Just rip a few strips of melamine, cut them to length, and then assemble them around the pieces to get a nice tight fit. And the stuff you see on the inside is called tuck tape, which helps to keep the epoxy from fusing to the melamine and just makes it a lot easier to remove. For this pour, we ended up using Total Boat Thickset, and this is so that we could do the entire pour at once. It's a 3-part to 1 mixture, so I made sure to measure everything out as accurately as possible, and then we got to it. Now, I'll say anytime you use epoxy, you want to make sure that everything is really good and sealed up. This stuff will find just about any crack or gap. And the Thickset is especially runny. I'm sure it's slightly more viscous than water, but honestly, you can't really tell. So yeah, again, just make sure you seal it up good. Otherwise, this will happen. One spill aside, taking these things out of the form actually went pretty smooth. What you see in this shot is just globs of hot glue that we had used to seal things up, and the easiest way that I found to remove this is with a multi-tool. Next, I used my joiner to clean up two faces, basically making sure that I milled until I struck wood. And then I could use my table saw to remove the rest of the overflow epoxy to bring my pieces down to square and their finished width and thicknesses. And by the way, if you hate sawdust, just wait till you work with epoxy shavings. They're actually not that bad. Alright, so the way that the base is going to come together is like this. I've got 4 legs that'll attach to 2 long aprons, and those are all the splintered epoxy wood parts. Then out of all hardwood, I'm going to make this capital I-shaped stretcher, and that along with 3 more stretchers are going to tie the front and the back legs together. As for how I was going to glue the epoxy pieces together, as you can see here in my test piece, one of my initial thoughts was to use a domino to attach them, though I probably would have made my own version of one. But I really like the idea of keeping it clear, so I decided I'd basically just do a butt joint using more epoxy, and honestly, I have no idea how strong this would be. Now, I wasn't worried about the piece collapsing because the force is all compression while it's just sitting there. But I would be worried about somebody trying to drag the piece sometime in the future, which could possibly shear one of the legs off. So I decided to try to reinforce it. So after I had it glued up and let it sit for a couple days, I unclamped it, and it felt pretty sturdy, honestly. But my idea was to drill as large and deep of a hole through one piece and into the other, and then fill that with more epoxy. Basically creating an epoxy dowel to tie the two together. Now, I have no idea if this did anything, but it sounded good in theory. Also, I think I'm actually going to test the strength of this piece, but I'll talk about that at the end of the video, so stay tuned if you're interested. For the rest of the base, it was just your standard domino joints in wood. Easy peasy. Okay, so moving back over to the cabinet side of things, the next thing we needed to do was make some doors. If you follow me on Instagram, you might remember the concept drawing I had. You can see my initial thought was to carve some kind of pattern into the doors with my CNC. And I drew up a few different versions, but I wasn't really liking any of them all that much. So instead I just decided to keep it a solid panel. So back when I had milled everything in the very beginning of the video, I had milled a few pieces down to 1/2 inch thick and a few panels that I glued up down to just under 1/4 inch thick. Here I'm ripping the 1/2 inch thick pieces to their finished widths. After that I tested them in the grooves of the doors to make sure that they'd slide nice, and I found that they were just a little bit too tight. So I gave them one more pass through the planer and then cross-cut all of the stiles to their finished lengths and the rails to a little bit longer than what they needed to be. From there I used my table saw to cut a groove into each rail and stile. And to make sure that it was centered, I would cut the piece, flip it around, and cut again. Then I'd move the fence, repeat, and just keep doing this until the panel fit easily in. Not too tight, not too loose. Next I lowered my blade and made a series of passes on both ends of each rail to create a little tongue, thing. A little piece that'll fit into the stile. Then I did a dry assembly to figure out the exact size that my panel should be, and headed over to the table saw to make those cuts. Then, with all of my pieces finalized, I could start gluing things together. And while I'm doing that, I want to thank Joel Harrison, Trip Southern, Joe Sexton, Elias Ash, Akshay, Chris Chandler, Ryan Widrig, Diakota Rector, Forrest Crenshaw, Nick Patterson, Todd King, Modern Day Wood, Gary Sekele, Aaron Percha, and the rest of my Patreon members for making these videos possible. You all should have either received your 4 Eyes t-shirts or they're currently in the mail. Unless, of course, you didn't tell me what size you wear yet. In that case, make sure to check your messages over on Patreon so you can let me know. But in any case, thank you. All of you. From those of you contributing $2 a month to those of you doing 50. Trust me when I say that every little bit helps, and honestly has and continues to make a real difference in my life and my ability to do all of this. So thank you. Really. And if you dig the videos too and want to find out more about how you can support the show, check out the Patreon link in the description and see if it's right for you. And as always, no pressure. With my doors fitting nicely, next I made some handles. So I started off by marking out roughly how big I thought they should be, and once I had that dialed in, I drew up a quick file and used my X-Carve to make a template. And I've been making it a point to keep all of these. That way eventually I'll just have like 10 different handle variations to choose from. Then I can just pick one that I like and get right to it instead of having to reinvent the wheel each time. For my back panels, I'm going to use some scrap 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood. And I'm going to make 3 smaller panels rather than one big one, just to better utilize my scrap pieces. After I had them all cut to fit nicely, again I used my CNC to route a long cable slot in the middle, and then used the first one as a template to put slots in the other 2. So, as I said in the beginning of the video, this project was a long time coming. It was just one of those situations where an opportunity came up, I had an idea, everything was locked in, but I just couldn't get to it for several months because of other obligations. Honestly though, I kind of like those situations. Especially when you have an idea for something that you've never tried before. It makes it a little extra fun and exciting, and admittedly a little scary. I mean, you plan it all out, you prepare the best you can, but you're never sure exactly how it's gonna go until you're out there on stage, or in your shop as it were, giving it a go. And hopefully, with a little luck, you pull it off. But I never wish you that, because the last thing that I'd want to do is jinx you. So I guess I'll just say, break a leg. And an apron. Speaking of breaking legs, like I said earlier, I'm not comfortable using or selling this piece with the base, so I think I'm going to strength test it to see how strong the epoxy joint actually is. Nothing scientific. But if you want to check that out, follow me on Instagram, and I'm going to post some videos in early November. Next time Sean is out, I figure since he had a hand in creating it, he should also have a hand in destroying it. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.